Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Lech Lecha. And of course, at Lech Lecha, we're introduced to Avraham, who's the father of the Jewish people. And this portion really is the beginning of Jewish history. And the opening lines, of course, are God instructs Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha u'mima'aladetecha mi'beis avicha, leave your land, your birthplace, and your father's house, and go to a land asher eka, which I will show you. And the way it's simply understood is God has chosen Avram to be the father of the Jewish nation. And what commentaries and any reader of this text would ask is, why did God choose Avram? What was so special about him? So many of us are familiar with the Medrash that gives us a backstory. It's not in the text at all, and you have to be aware of that. The backstory is that Avram's father, Terach, owned an idol store on some strip mall back in Ur Kasdim, or Charan, and he was instructed one day to take care of the store while his father Terach was out. And when Terach comes back, he finds that Avram has destroyed all of the idols. And they tell a story about how Avram told Terach, well, the idols, they were fighting with each other and they knocked each other down. And Terach says, of course, that can't happen. They're just stone and wood. And Avram says, aha, you see, they have no power. There's only one God. So it draws a picture of Avram as someone who was finally breaking with the past, no longer is going to serve and worship idols, but believes in one God. So Avram is the father of monotheism. And then as the story goes on, he's taken to Nimrod, who, according to tradition, is the king at that time in the area in which they lived. And Nimrod throws him into a fiery furnace, and miraculously Avram survives. So we see that not only was he a monotheist and the one who's establishing monotheism, but he was willing to give up his life for his beliefs, and God saved him miraculously. And then God says, okay, now it's time to leave and go to the land of Canaan, which is the future land of Israel. But the question we might ask is, this is not in the text at all. And the question is, do we need the backstory of the Medrash to fill in our understanding of Avram's greatness and why he was chosen by God? Or could we see it in the text itself? And I would like to suggest that without the Medrash, we could see the development of Avram and Avram's special and unique status as the forefather of the Jewish people from the text itself. But to do that, you have to sort of step back and say, is there really a discussion of idolatry and monotheism throughout the book of Bereshit, throughout the whole book of Genesis, talking about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? There are some hints of it. There are some talk of using, first of all, God's special name, and Avram has a discussion with a king when he comes out from warring with the four kings. There's hints here and there, but there's no real discussion about monotheism versus idolatry. And perhaps that's not really the story. The story of believing in one God is certainly a Jewish idea. We read it in the Shema, but the Shema is only in the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Listen, Israel, that God is one. And we understand that God is one. And in the book of Shemos, we see Moshe introducing the God of Israel, who's going to be superior and destroy the gods that exist in Egypt, right? So we see this sort of development, but there's never any philosophical discussion or way of understanding that there's one God, except for the one verse that I mentioned that's in Deuteronomy and Devarim. So maybe what's really more important is not the fact that we're creating monotheism. The idea and the belief in God and the God of the Jewish people, that seems to be just taken for granted in the book of Bereshit. That's the same God who speaks to Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. In a couple generations later, in the time of Enosh, it says, Azhu chalikro b'shem Hashem. Then he started to call in the name of God. The name of God seems to be something which they use either in prayer or maybe spoken about. It doesn't talk about monotheism, but it uses the four-letter name of God. We know that there were great people before Avram. It says Chanoch, in a very much earlier generation, he walked with God, and he's no longer with us, and we assume that he was taken up and never died and lives up in the heaven. It's not clear in the text again, but it says he walked with God. And perhaps the idea of going to Israel was not even Avram's idea, because if you look at the end of the last portion of Noach, it was actually Terach, his father, who decided to move to Israel, to Canaan. And he took Avram and Avram's wife Sarah, or Sarai, and Lot, his nephew, or the nephew of Avram, the grandson of Terach, and they started to go to the land of Canaan. But as the Torah tells us, they didn't end up there. They ended up on their way in the city of Haran, and they never made it to the land of Canaan. The story this week, in this week's portion, picks up, and now Avram actually goes and he carries out the original plan of Terach without Terach, and he leaves his father and he leaves his father's household to go to the land of Canaan, but it wasn't even his idea. So, and why the land of Canaan? What's so special about the land of Canaan? So again, we understand, and we have a tradition that the land of Israel is a holy land, but maybe there's something simpler here. Maybe what we're really looking for, what God is looking for, what the Torah is looking for, is someone who's able to start something fresh, who has a sense of independence, that has the ability to move forward on his own. And therefore, what we describe in Avram is someone who marries a woman. That's what we talked about when we're introduced to Avram. He marries a woman, Sarai, and it doesn't tell you who her parents are. And I know there's midrashim who tell us who her father was, but simply the text doesn't say who her parents were. And it says that his brother Haran, he died back in Ur Kasdim, Be'eretz Moladato, in the land of his birthplace. He was not able to take the move and to jump and to move forward. His brother Nachar, he marries someone who, it says who her parents were. And therefore, perhaps they're more stuck where they come from. They're not able to move forward. They're not able to change. They're not able to develop new ideas and a new culture and start a new nation because they're tied to the past, very simply. And therefore, when he marries Sarai, it goes out of its way not to give her lineage. And then the first thing we're told about his wife Sarai is Sarai Akara, Ein Lo Vlad. She's barren. She has no children. There are no ties. He has no children. He can move. And then when he finally moves, where does he go? He goes to the land of Canaan, and we're told he doesn't stay in any city or move to any city. He goes to Makom Shechem, the area around Shechem, or he goes between he pitches his tent in where Beisel is in the west, and the city of Beisel in the west, and the city of Ai in the east. He's not living in any cities. As we know from the stories, Avram is a nomad. He's not living in any particular city. He's not becoming part of those tribes. He's not trying to integrate into the society of Canaan. He's going to a land to move away from the great powers that were. He lived in Ur Kasdim, the area of Mesopotamia, which is a flat area, and it did have more kingdoms. We know that that's what we call the Fertile Crescent, where civilization arose, and there was strong central authority. He was moving away from authority, and where was he going? He wasn't going all the way to Egypt, which was the next empire which had a central authority, but rather he went right in between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Where did he live? Where did he establish his roots? In the land of Canaan, where there was no central authority. There was many different nations. When Joshua finally comes in to conquer the land for the Jewish people, we know that there are 31 different city-states, and it's a mountainous region. Every little city was its own little nation, its own little tribe. And therefore, if you didn't go to those cities, you could be a nomad and live between the cities and live independently. So the land of Israel is holy not because it's inherently holy necessarily, but rather the holiness is because you're able to establish something new. You're able to establish a new nation which follows God and follows the Torah. And that's perhaps why Avram went. And it wasn't even his idea, as I said. It was Terach's idea, but he was able to carry it forward. He was able to move. And then he's challenged by going to Egypt in the very first story after he lands in Canaan. He has to go to Egypt because of a famine. And it's showing that he doesn't want to stay in either Egypt or where he comes from, because he wants to be able to be independent. And that's the strength of Avram, and that's apparent in the text. Not because he's a monotheist, which he might have been, not because he was devoted to God, which he could have been, and he probably was. And we see that throughout the stories as they develop. But what we have in Avram is someone who has a very important character trait. He's independent. So when you do have ideas, you're able to establish them. You're not necessarily tied to the past and unable to move forward. And that's exactly what happens with Avram. And he establishes a nation. So really, what we need for nation building might be as important or more important than the theology and the ideology of Judaism. Those things are necessary, and our survival is because we have these ideas and a belief in one God, and many of the different philosophical outlooks which come as because we understand sort of the world from that perspective. It's extremely important, but it might not be what's needed as far as character traits in order to establish that the Jewish nation and the land of Israel. And that's a different way of looking at the text, different way of understanding the biblical figures, that what they really represent is the holiness is not necessarily what's really the guiding force in their lives to establish Jewish nation, but their ability to establish a nation. And you take that together with holiness, with spirituality, with devotion to God, with morals and with ethics, then you're able to really, that is really the roots of the Jewish nation. And perhaps that's a sign for us that we have to always retain that sense of independence, be able to look at things from a fresh perspective, not necessarily to be tied to exactly what we were told, but one of the beauties of Judaism is our ability to constantly ask questions, to constantly challenge the past and look towards the future. Good Shabbos.